Jellyfish Fossils in Saginaw, Michigan, and Other Great Finds During the Summer of 2013 by Dennis M. Morrison. During the summer of 2013, on my expeditions out and about, I made some wonderful fossil finds here in Saginaw, Michigan, as well as some pretty cool relics, too. I'd like to share with you some of the more interesting finds that I made. The west side of Saginaw, Michigan is not where one would typically expect to find the fossil remains of ancient jellyfish. Nonetheless, over the past 3 years, I have found 4 of these incredibly rare pieces of ancient marine life. This is due partly to the late Victorian dwellers of Saginaw who enjoyed putting limestone slab borders around their gardens, pathways, courtyards, and even built fences from them. As fossils go, jellyfish are rather at the rare end of the spectrum because they are soft-bodied and decompose quickly when they die, so they just don't fossilize very well. It actually takes very specific conditions for jellyfish to fossilize. The dead jellyfish must be covered rapidly by sand or other sediment before the decay sets in, and this means they must be covered almost immediately. But first let me back up and tell you how I found these. On Court Street in Saginaw is a block of very old buildings, and the way they are situated, there is an alley behind them, and at the back of the alley, one end is a barn that was built in the early 1860s. The barn has been carefully restored by the owners and is a beautiful old structure. But in front of the barn is a sort of courtyard where flowers are planted, and it's very private. Most passerbys don't even know that it's there. The flower garden has been edged with slabs of limestone, and these are abundant throughout Saginaw, as it was brought in literally by the tons during the 1880s and 1890s for the decorative uses that I've already described. And most of this limestone is devoid of fossil formations. However, there are a few scattered here and there that are abundant with impressions of ancient marine life that once filled the shallow, warm seas that would one day be Michigan and the Great Lakes. It was on the edge of the flower garden that I saw a piece of limestone that had been split down the middle where you could open it almost like a book. The surface was dark gray and had some lichens growing on it, but more importantly there was a 5-inch impression of the bell of a jellyfish on the surface of it. The second layer also bore a fine impression of the same jellyfish, so I actually got 2 for 1. And another slab laying close by, partially covered by dirt, yielded 2 more partial jellyfish fossils. Now you might wonder how I recognized them as such. The 5-inch specimen was rounded and I could actually see a few of the tentacles trailing off. Now few years before I had found a smaller specimen of the same limestone in my front yard and had that one examined by an avid collector nationally known, and so it was quite easy to recognize these specimens. These jellyfish would have been from the Cambrian era, which means they could be as many as 1.9 million years old, based on what science says. As a Christian, I don't believe the world is quite that old. I am basing my dating on another find that was made in Wisconsin of very similar fossils. If you draw a straight line across Michigan from Saginaw and then inland to Mosinee, Wisconsin, there you'll find a limestone quarry where a rather spectacular find of jellyfish fossils was made back in 2001. And these are called Medusa, and there were quite a few found. From comparing those specimens in Wisconsin with mine, I would say they are of the same species. The limestone, which was brought into Saginaw, came from 2 different areas in Michigan. Some of it came to the Thumb area, and a lot came from Alpena on Thunder Bay. The limestone from Alpena tends to be much more prolific in bearing fossils, but it's all from the same era. In recent times, some very dramatic fossil finds of jellyfish have been also made in Australia and in Utah. The fossils from Utah are among the oldest ever found and are estimated, are you ready for this, at being over 500 million years old. But the Australia finds, while not as ancient, is unique in that not just a few were found, but literally hundreds at one site. But back to my finds. The specimens I recovered ranged in size from about 1 inch to 5 inches across, and as near as I can ascertain, they are all from the Cambrian period. And also prevalent in this limestone are crinoid stems, as well as shells and tube worms, with a few brachiopods thrown in for good measure. Another fascinating and equally rare fossil I collected this year is that of a caterpillar. This fossil was found in red shale from the Pennsylvanian era, which is the time frame most of our coal deposits come from. This is a semicircular impression with ridges, but it's quite impossible to tell what species it is. This was found near the Shiawassee Wildlife Preserve here in Saginaw. The shale, which is abundant in and around the preserve, was brought to the surface during extensive coal mining operations of the late 1890s and early 1900s. To reach the valuable coal underground, mine shafts first had to go through layers of fossil-bearing shale. And the shale from this area ranges from black to red to salmon and gray in color. This shale primarily produces fossil impressions of plant life. And that being said, let's look at a few of those now. Now here's a fairly large shale specimen. I particularly like this because of how the surface is textured, but this has a really amazing fossil impression, though it is difficult to show in the photographs, but you'll see it in the upper portion of the photograph. This has a section of branch or root from a lepidodendron, which is also known as a scale tree. This type of tree had a tall, thick trunk that rarely branched, and they were topped with a crown of bifurcating branches bearing clusters of leaves. These leaves were long and narrow, similar to large blades of grass, and were spirally arranged. The fossil impression here shows a section of one of those leaves and was found in the same general location, except this is on gray shale. These are easily identified by the diamond-like scars on the fossil impressions. The closely packed diamond shapes are leaf scars on the trunk and stems, and they were formed as the plant grew. These provide some of the most interesting and common fossils in the Carboniferous shales and associated coal deposits. The scars or leaf cushions were composed of green photosynthetic tissue, evidenced by the cuticle covering and being dotted with stomata, microscopic pores through which carbon dioxide from the air diffuses into the plants. Likewise, the trunk of the scale tree would have been green, unlike modern trees which have scaly, non-photosynthetic brown and gray bark. This particular specimen measures 9 by 6 by 1.5 inches and is very cool, a very cool display piece. And these trees were abundant in the Saginaw and Michigan area during the Pennsylvanian era. Now, another plant that was quite common in ancient times in this area of Michigan was the Calla Mite. Now, the Calla Mite is related to the horsetail plant, which grows abundantly in swampy areas today. But these only reach a height of about 15 inches, whereas the ancient Calla Mite grew to heights of 100 feet and more. Calla Mites are genus of extinct tree-like horsetails. They were a main plant of the Carboniferous period, around 360 to 300 million years ago. As you can see in this photograph of the specimen I found here in Saginaw, the trunk of the Calla Mite had a distinctive segmented bamboo-like appearance and vertical ribbing. The branches and leaves and cones were all borne in the whorls. The leaves were needle-shaped with up to 25 per whorl. Their trunks produced secondary xylem, meaning they were made of wood. The stems of the modern horsetails are typically hollow and contain air-filled sacs, which sets them apart from their ancient cousins. The specimen I recovered is on gray-red gritty shale, showing one of the stem segments with several small dimples. The matrix this is on measures 4 by 3 by 3/4 inches, and again is a superb display specimen. Concretions now are fairly common finds among the shale which has been deposited on the surface of the ground here, while concretions are not in and of themselves fossils. But as you can see by the photos here, I found quite a variety near the shale deposits, so these also hail from the Carboniferous era. Now, concretion is a hard, compact mass of sedimentary rock formed by the precipitation of mineral cement within the spaces between sediment grains. Very often, the concretion is formed around material which has become fossilized, so breaking open concretions oftentimes reveals stunning fossils. I've not broken any open that I have found, as I think their shapes are quite fascinating, and to find out what is inside, you have to destroy the outside. Now, this round concretion is very unique and rather enigmatic, and I'm not so sure it's ancient. Its round shape is almost too perfect, and I believe this may be part of a piece of mining equipment which would date it to the late 1800s, early 1900s. But the outer cortex is composed of, I believe, a very heavy rust which has grown around chunks of coal and other smaller rocks. This is very hard, but nowhere near as hard as other concretions I have found from the same site. But by the same token, for its size, this one is much, much heavier than the other concretions I have found. And this one measures about 4.5 inches across by 2 inches. Now here's a bone that is what I actually call a pre-fossil and was the most interesting find. I described to you earlier the 1860s barn which had been restored, and in digging around the foundation I recovered this bone which I presume was from the era that the barn was built. The bone is richly textured on the surface and a really beautiful orange-brown patina. And I'm not sure what animal this is from, but likely a common farm animal like a cow or horse or etc. This is a non-moving joint, as you can see by my photographs, and it comes apart, revealing the inner structure of the bone. And this fine display specimen measures 6 by 3 by 4 inches. That site particularly is very abundant in bone specimens. Now lastly here are some really neat pieces that are not fossils, but are relics, but are pretty amazing in my opinion. First is a selection of antique grinding wheel fragments I found on the Saginaw River, actually quite near the city. This was a site where there was at one time a foundry, again back near the turn of the century. These quite likely were made right here in Michigan at Grindstone City, which is located in the thumb area of the state. There are broken grindstones at this site ranging from only a few inches across to several feet across, but the largest which I collected measured only about 8 inches across. And also found was a large section of, or a large selection of small tubular grinding pieces. This site was prolific in interesting specimens of which I collected quite a few. The largest was this, as I'm showing you now, Graphite Crucible, which was used either for smelting iron or colored pigments. The crucible measures 30 inches tall by 15 across and 1.5 inches thick. And I found it with only a portion sticking out of the riverbank. It was quite difficult to dig out. I was very surprised that it was intact when I did get it dug out because there were so many broken ones lying about. And this is made out of graphite, the same material used in pencils, and quite possibly could have been made in Saginaw also because there was a graphite manufacturing company located here, again, way back. Now, also shown here is a portion of a side and a base piece of another crucible. The day I brought this home was one of the hottest days in July this past summer, well up into the 90s, very high humidity. And I placed the crucible in a four-wheel cart, and it just barely fit. It was heavy. I thought, because it had absorbed a lot of water where it had been, and I thought I would die from heat exhaustion that day before I got it home, especially going over the Court Street Bridge, which was has quite an upward slope, and you don't really notice it when you're driving, but when you're walking it, pulling something like this behind you, believe me, you notice it. There have been a multitude of other fossils and relics I've been fortunate enough to find this past summer, but these were some of my favorites, and I hope you've enjoyed seeing them.